guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to share with you my top 5 eyeshadow palette recommendations for beginners. All of these palettes have really easy to work with formulas, color combinations, and are just really quick and easy palette to use when you don't want to spend a lot of time on your eyeshadow, you don't want to do complicated looks, you just want to keep things really simple. So if you guys want to know what my top 5 recommendations are for beginners, then just keep on watching. Alright, so the first palette I'm going to start off with is an all matte eyeshadow palette, and I normally don't do all matte looks, but with this palette I always use it when I have like a lid color that's going to be a pressed glitter or something that really stands out, because all of the matte shades in here are some of my favorite shades, really blendable formula and really easy to work with other palettes or other colors in my collection. So this palette is the Too Faced Natural Matte Palette. This is a $38 palette. It's mostly a warm brown palette, but there's some more like neutrally tones in here as well. Actually, there's like a whole row of cool tone shades right here too. You have 3 light base colors. I basically just set my eye with one of these 3 shades, and then a bunch of transition shades from light to deep here as well, and they all layer together really nicely. So that's what I like about this palette too. Everything's like in the same color family, so you can use like 4 or 5 of these different shades, blend them together, and it's not going to end up looking muddy or weird. They're all just going to blend together really smoothly. And I also think when you are starting out with eyeshadow, or you don't really like to spend a lot of time on eyeshadow, mattes are really forgiving and really easy. So if you just want to use a matte shade to like highlight on your lid, that's still gonna pop against like some of these darker transition shades, and you could just use 1 or 2 of them and they're gonna layer really nicely. So you can get a complete eye look with this palette in like 2 minutes, whether you're a beginner or advanced. Like very simple eye looks, very straightforward eye looks, but still something that actually shows up and it stands out and is really easy to work with. Really like that. I think the formula is great for beginners because it's like something that blends itself basically. That's what I'm gonna say about pretty much all of these palettes. Like it's not something that you can get too carried away with, or you have to spend a lot of time like building up. It's like right in the middle where you're gonna get pigmentation off the bat, but you can blend it and diffuse it out to make it more toned down if you want to as well. So next up, this is like an underrated palette that's also very neutral, but you're gonna get a lot of shimmer shades in here. This is the Persona Cosmetics Identity Palette for $32. This is available online at Ulta. This is a gorgeous palette, super underrated in my opinion. Has a lot of matte shades, has a lot of neutrally tones and also cool tones, and then these shimmers are super beautiful. This green shade, Bombshell, is one of my favorites in my collection because I love neutral olive greens. So all the shimmers are absolutely gorgeous. You don't have to really build them up or anything like that to make them stand out. Like they just swatch and look beautiful on their own. But then if you don't want to use like a wet brush, or you just want to apply them with your finger, you can apply them really lightly and you're gonna get a really nice sheen on your lid if you don't want something like super intense or metallic, especially when you're starting off with eyeshadows. So with the shimmers especially, it's more of like a buttery, shimmery shade and not something like what you're gonna get in an Anastasia palette, like what I have on my eyes today from the Norvina palette. That's a metallic foiled shade that if you apply too much at once, like it's gonna be super intense on your eyes. So this is something that you can build to your liking basically. And then the mattes are also very buttery, very creamy and easy to blend out. They're not overly pigmented off the bat. So definitely really love this palette, especially if you love neutrals, but you can see there's like some smokier shades in here too if you want to get into those more like nighttime looks, but you can still keep them pretty simple, just like a 2 shadow look, like a matte shade and a lid color, like a shimmer in here, and you're totally good to go. Another palette that I like to go for like 2-3 minute eye looks, and you're done. Like nothing too complicated with that one. Next up, we have a really affordable palette that's great if you are starting off with eyeshadows. You don't want to spend a lot of money, but you want a good quality palette and you want some variation in different shades. So this is the new Classics palette from e.l.f. This is $14. This is a very neutral palette. We have a couple like colors in here too. You have some pinks, a green, some like purpley shades in here. So still like in the neutral family, but we're getting a little bit more into color. There's a lot to choose from for transition shades, a lot of lighter tones, and basically everything to black in here as well. So you have a lot of variation, a lot of different shades to work with, but it's not so overwhelming that you can't use basically any of the transition shades or any of the lid shades together. Like I could use this green with this purpley shade or with this shade over here. I could basically use any of the shimmers with any of the mattes. I could use like 3 of the mattes at the same time and they're gonna blend together nicely because it's all fairly in the same color family. So this is another palette that I think is like pretty straightforward. You're not gonna get overwhelmed with all the colors, but you have a lot more to choose from than some of the other palettes that I'm gonna mention. So really, really like this palette. The mattes in here are very creamy, very blendable. Those are just some of the lighter tones. Let me play with 1 or 2 more of the mattes. So you're gonna get some variations in the neutrals. Those are some of the matte shades, and then let me swatch some of the shimmer shades because they're actually like really impressive. All right, so this is about half of the palette, just like really quick swatches of some of the shimmers. And you can see that some of the shimmer shades are not so, I want to say heavy on the eye. They're going to be more softer colors, so you're not going to get something super intense right off the bat. It's something that you can wet your brush to get more of a metallic look, but you can keep your brush dry to make it more of like a subtle sheen. And even though I'm saying this is more of like a buildable eyeshadow formula, it's not buildable where it's not pigmented at all. Like it's definitely pigmented. The mattes and the shimmers are very pigmented, but you can take them from like a natural look to a very dramatic look by just like packing them on even more. So it's definitely not something that you have to like sit and make like show up on your face. It's definitely pigmented off the bat, but it's not so pigmented that it's gonna end up looking muddy. If you're just playing around with different color combinations, it's kind of forgiving because you can kind of blend it and diffuse it out with both the matte shades and the shimmer shades. And of course, it's gonna be the more affordable palette that I mentioned. It's one of the best affordable palettes in my collection. All right, so next up we have my all-time favorite palette. That is the Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette. I love this palette so much. When you look inside, you can definitely tell I've given this palette so much love. And this is something that's gonna be a bolder formula than some of the other palettes that I mentioned. It's gonna give you more color payoff right off the bat. So if you don't normally wear eyeshadows, this is the palette that's gonna give you a little bit more dramatic looks because the pigmentation is there, the color payoff is there, but it's also something that you can still tone down, you can still blend out easily. It's not gonna give you a lot of fallout or get messy if you get carried away like blending a shade too high or anything like that, because this is a very, very creamy formula. It doesn't ever look patchy. You can layer all these colors together, especially like this whole top row. If you really like warm tones, I would definitely suggest this palette because like all of the mattes in here, well, we have 2 colorful mattes that you guys can tell I barely ever use. I basically just use like this whole, basically everything but these 2 shades, honestly. But I love these mattes. They are so blendable, super, super creamy, super easy to work with. You can just layer like this whole row together. It's like makes this palette very straightforward because I use this to set my eye. I start transition with this shade. I use this shade or this shade, and then sometimes I will use this for my outer corner. And you can do that with all of these lid colors. So a lot of times when I'm using this palette, I will do basically the exact same eye look, but replace it between these 3 lid colors. This is a palette I use when I have 10 minutes to do my entire face of makeup and put on lashes. I reach for this palette no matter what because it's gonna blend quickly. I'm gonna get a really dramatic lid shade on my eye super quickly. I'm gonna diffuse all the shadows out very, very quickly. I feel like whenever I'm using this palette and I'm rushing, I don't think about what shade to use. I just put my brush somewhere and put it on my face and it always works out. And that's what I've been doing with this palette for the last year, and that's why I definitely recommend it because I find it to be very, very foolproof and straightforward because especially all the matte shades, well, at least all of the top matte shades are like in the same color family, so it's not gonna be something you really have to get too creative with, but you can still get those creative looks by just spending a little bit more time with some of these bottom shades. So the shimmers in here are definitely going to be the more dramatic shades compared to some of the other palettes. But if you just apply it with like a fluffy brush or just apply it like more lightly, you can definitely get a more subtle look. I always apply it with a wet brush to get like a really foiled look. So you can definitely play with this palette. And also if you are more of a beginner with eyeshadow, this is a cool palette because as you get more advanced in eyeshadow and like play with different color combinations, you can make this palette like look more dramatic as well. So lastly, we have the most intricate palette of the 5, and this is the Urban Decay Born to Run palette. This palette is $49, and this is the palette that's going to give you a ton of variety. And if you are newer to eyeshadow or you don't normally wear eyeshadow but you want to play with some color, I would suggest this palette because you have a lot of color, you have a lot to work with, but it's not overwhelming and you're not going to get lost when you look at this palette because there's just some pops of colors and really you get a lot of neutral shades. So you can start off very subtle with the colors and then just work your way to different more creative looks if you want to with this palette as well, because you have those transition shades and you have those different colors to work with to do just like a little bit of color or a lot of color if you want. And then with this formula, the shimmers are more of that like satin smooth kind of a shimmer shade and not those metallic foiled shades. So you could do like a light wash of color, you could do more dramatic if you want to wet your brush. You can apply them in different ways. If you apply it with like a tacky base or apply it with your finger, you might get more dramatic looks as well. But if you just want to do like a soft, like everyday pinky tone eye look or purple or something without getting too complicated, you could definitely do that with this palette. So really love the shades in here. If you are just new to color in general, these are very like easy colors to work with because they're not so out there, and you can layer them with like any of these neutral matte shades for your crease or anything. So if you take a look at all the shades in the palette, there's enough like purpley shades, enough blue shades, enough like orange shades that you don't have to look at this palette and be like, how am I going to use this blue shade with like something like this down here? Because sometimes in colorful palettes it's just like one green, one purple, one orange, one red, and you're like, okay, how do I make that work? But with this palette, you're gonna get enough shades from each color palette that you don't have to overthink an eye look. And then of course you can use basically any color in here with any of these like lighter, very neutral shades as well. So you can just use like one color at a time and like work your way into using a lot of different color combinations. So even if you are somebody who actually wears eyeshadow every day, but maybe you do like the same eye look like every day, something like very, very neutral, I think this would be like the perfect palette because you still get a lot of neutral in here and you get a lot of different undertones in the neutral shades, and then you get a lot of pops of colors that are easy to blend into different neutral looks. And then if you want to get into all colorful looks, you can definitely do that with this palette too. So you're gonna get a lot of variety for like basically every occasion, something like very natural, something very quick and easy, casual, but still like very dramatic. Colorful looks in here too. It's gonna be great for like basically everything. All right guys, so those are all of my top 5 beginner friendly eyeshadow palette recommendations. All of these are really easy to work with formulas. I feel like they're very foolproof formulas that are very forgiving if you apply too much, too little, and really you don't have to be super precise with your brushes with these palettes. Sometimes with my formulas that are more metallic or very powdery, I have to be very precise with like smaller brushes. But with all of these, they're like very buildable formulas that you don't have to be like overly precise with what tools you use to get your different eye looks. So that's something I really like about all of these palettes as well. But that's going to be everything for today's video. If you guys liked it, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I'll talk to you guys soon in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.